The morning air over Arlington National Cemetery was sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. A soft wind stirred through rows of white headstones, each a silent testament to service and sacrifice. Among them sat a German shepherd, his coat dark but greying at the muzzle, his frame lean yet dignified. His name was Ranger. He had been waiting for hours, his paws pressed into the soil, his amber eyes fixed on a single grave as though the rest of the world no longer existed. Visitors passing by slowed their steps, drawn by the sight of the lone K9 who refused to leave. Some whispered that he must have belonged to the soldier buried beneath the stone, while others lifted their phones to capture his quiet vigil. If you believe in loyalty that never fades, take a moment to subscribe and join us on this journey, because what follows is not only Ranger's story, it is a story about courage, loss, and the strength to keep waiting when the world says it's time to let go. Ranger's vest still bore the faded outline of the US Army patch, the Velcro edges frayed from years of service. Once that vest had been bright, strapped tight as he ran alongside soldiers in the heat of Afghanistan, his nose trained on danger, his ears tuned to the sound of his handler's voice. That handler was Sergeant Daniel Cole. To the world, Daniel had been marked as gone, killed in action on a night that left Ranger broken and displaced. But the dog did not know paperwork, reports, or official seals. He only knew that Daniel had vanished, and that the scent he had once followed everywhere had disappeared into silence. People who stopped to watch him could only guess at what kept him there. A woman in a wool coat dabbed her eyes and whispered, "He's crying. Can you hear it?" Indeed, Ranger's whimpers carried low and steady, the kind of sound that pierced even the most guarded hearts. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why doesn't someone take him home?" The father, a veteran himself, shook his head. "That is home for him now. That grave is where his partner rests." The truth was more complicated, and yet more devastating. Ranger had been retired after Daniel's disappearance, placed in the care of a veterans support group in Virginia. They had done their best, feeding him, walking him, even enrolling him in therapy programs designed for both dogs and humans who carried scars from war. But nothing could erase the instinct that pulled him back here. One night, with the quiet patience of a soldier, Ranger had slipped away, trotting through darkened streets, until he found his way to this cemetery. Since then, he returned day after day, sometimes sitting still for hours, sometimes pacing circles as though searching for a command he no longer heard. What people didn't realize as they snapped pictures and posted stories online was that Ranger's vigil was not just about loss, it was about hope. In his own way, he waited not because he believed Daniel was gone, but because some part of him could not accept the silence as final. The grave stood as a marker, yes, but for Ranger, it was a doorway that refused to close. As the wind swept across the grounds, Ranger lowered his head, pressing his nose against the cold stone, breathing in a scent that had long since faded. His ears twitched at distant footsteps, his body tensed for a moment, then softened again when he realized it was just another passerby. The waiting continued. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving Ranger in his quiet vigil. The sun rose higher, shadows lengthened, and yet he did not move far. To him, loyalty was not bound by time. It was carved into his very being. And though the world had written Daniel's name into marble, Ranger's heart refused to surrender to that final word. What none of the onlookers could imagine was that this vigil was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far more powerful, a journey that would test the meaning of devotion and uncover a truth long buried in silence. Heat pressed down like a heavy blanket over the Afghan desert, the kind that dried throats and burned skin within minutes. Dust clung to boots, weapons, and uniforms, and every breath tasted of grit. Among the patrol moving cautiously along a dirt road was Ranger, his nose low to the ground, his ears twitching with focus. The German shepherd worked with the intensity of a soldier who understood lives depended on him. Beside him walked Sergeant Daniel Cole, calm but alert, his hand occasionally brushing Ranger's neck in a silent reminder of their bond. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice low and steady. "You got this." The squad trusted Ranger more than any piece of equipment they carried. The dog's training was sharper than most men's instincts, honed through months at Lackland Air Force Base before deployment. He could sniff out explosives buried deep beneath sand, pick up the faintest trace of gunpowder, or signal when danger hid in the brush ahead. And when he sat down stiffly or froze in place, the entire squad listened without question. Private Harris, the youngest in the unit, often joked nervously, "I'd follow that dog blindfolded before I'd trust the map." The others laughed, but there was no exaggeration in the statement. Ranger had already saved their lives more than once. The memory of one particular day lingered in Daniel's mind. The squad was advancing toward a small village, children playing in the distance, women carrying water jars. Something seemed almost too calm. Ranger slowed, his body rigid, his tail low. Daniel felt the tension ripple through the leash. "What's he got?" Sergeant Miller asked, scanning the horizon. Daniel crouched beside Ranger, reading every detail of his posture. "He smells something." "Everyone halt." The unit froze, eyes darting across the dusty ground. Ranger's nose pressed toward a patch of dirt that looked no different from the rest. Daniel gave the hand signal. Ranger sat, locked in place, ears back. "IED," Daniel said firmly. Careful digging later confirmed it. A hidden bomb, enough to rip the convoy apart, lay buried beneath the earth where the children had just run past minutes earlier. Relief washed over the men, and one of them clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Your partner just saved all of us." Daniel looked at Ranger, who simply wagged his tail once, tongue lolling out as if the near disaster was nothing more than another day's work. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't just instinct, it was loyalty, sharpened by training but rooted in something deeper. Ranger worked not because he was commanded to, but because he belonged at Daniel's side. Their bond only grew in the small moments between missions. Daniel shared his rations, slipping pieces of jerky or bread to Ranger under the stars. At night, when gunfire echoed faintly from distant hills, Daniel would rest his hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. It anchored him, reminded him that not everything in this war was chaos. "You're the only one who gets it, huh?" Daniel whispered one evening, the desert wind tugging at his uniform. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes glinting in the moonlight, and leaned closer until his weight pressed against Daniel's side. No words were needed. The squad came to rely not only on Ranger's skill, but also on the quiet strength he gave Daniel. When exhaustion dragged men down, Ranger's presence lifted them. When fear threatened to paralyze them, the sight of him trotting confidently forward gave them courage. Yet beneath every successful mission, there was an unspoken truth. War didn't grant guarantees. Each patrol carried the risk that one mistake, one hidden threat, could end it all. And though Ranger's nose had spared them many times, Daniel knew they couldn't escape the reality that danger waited just ahead, patient and merciless. Still, Ranger never hesitated. He moved forward because Daniel moved forward. And Daniel, no matter how heavy the weight on his shoulders, knew that with Ranger by his side he was never alone. What neither of them realized then was that their loyalty would soon face a test far harsher than any battlefield could offer, a night when everything would change. Night fell over the outpost like a curtain, the desert turning cold as quickly as it had been scorching just hours before. The squad moved under the dim light of a waning moon, boots sinking softly into the dirt. Ranger padded ahead, nose sharp, ears pricked, his body tense with the awareness that silence in Afghanistan often meant danger was close. Daniel Cole kept his grip firm on the leash, his eyes scanning every shadow. "We'll cut through the orchard and circle back toward the road," Sergeant Miller instructed in a hushed tone. "Stay tight," Daniel nodded, signaling to Ranger. The German shepherd slowed his pace, his muscles rippling with alertness. Private Harris muttered from the rear, "Feels too quiet. I don't like it." "You'll never like it," Daniel replied without looking back. His voice was calm, meant to reassure, though inside he felt the same creeping unease. Ranger's tail stiffened, his nose twitching furiously at the air. Daniel felt the tension pull through the leash. "Something's off," he whispered. Before the warning could spread, the night exploded. Gunfire rattled from the tree line, echoing like thunder, bullets snapping through branches. The squad dove for cover, shouting over one another. Ranger barked furiously, straining against Daniel's hold, his growls drowned by the chaos. "Incoming left flank," someone yelled. Daniel pulled Ranger behind a wall of crumbled stone, pressing his body low. He fired back, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. Dirt sprayed into the air as rounds tore into the ground nearby. Adrenaline burned through him, every sense locked on survival. Then came the blast. An improvised explosive detonated yards away, the shockwave slamming Daniel against the wall. His ears rang, vision blurred, and the taste of dust filled his mouth. Ranger yelped, scrambling to his side, pressing close as if to shield him. I'm good, Daniel rasped, though pain seared through his ribs. He tried to rise but staggered, the world tilting around him. Miller's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back, we're pinned too hard. Daniel grabbed Ranger's harness, forcing himself to push forward, but in the confusion of shouting, smoke, and gunfire, another blast erupted. This time it was closer. Daniel felt the ground vanish beneath him, a crushing force knocking him into darkness. When his eyes fluttered open, the battlefield was nothing but muffled noise and scattered shapes. He could see Ranger's face hovering over him, the dog whining, nudging his chest as if urging him to rise. Daniel tried, but his body refused. His last memory before the blackness swallowed him again was Ranger's desperate bark fading into distance. Back at the forward operating base, the survivors regrouped. Casualty reports came in one by one. Daniel Cole was unaccounted for. His squad searched, calling his name into the dust-filled night, but no sign came back. Ranger, frantic, had to be restrained by 2 soldiers as he pulled toward the battlefield, refusing to accept the retreat. His cries echoed louder than the gunfire that still rattled the hills. The next morning, the official report was written, Sergeant Daniel Cole, presumed killed in action. No body had been recovered, but protocol demanded closure. Ranger was transported back, his handler's gear removed, his vest marked for retirement. To the army, Daniel's story ended there, another name to be etched into stone. Yet for Ranger, the absence of a body meant nothing. He had seen Daniel fall, had smelled his blood and felt his weakness, but he had not felt the finality of death. Dogs did not understand reports or ranks. They understood presence, and Daniel's had vanished into silence. That silence became Ranger's burden, a weight no one else could see. The squad mourned, but time moved forward. Ranger, however, carried the moment like an open wound, restless and inconsolable, his bond broken in a night of chaos that still echoed in his every dream. The transition from battlefield to quiet suburb was not a gentle one for Ranger. One day he was pulling against his leash under gunfire, his nose sifting through the smells of dust, gunpowder, and sweat. The next, he was lying in a neat yard in Virginia, surrounded by trimmed grass and picket fences. His handler was gone. The army had declared him too restless for adoption by a family, so he was placed under the care of a veterans support group. They meant well. They gave him food, a warm bed, and kind hands. But for Ranger, none of it felt right. He paced often, claws scratching against wooden floors. At night, he barked at shadows, startling the men who lived there. "Easy, buddy," said Mike Reynolds, a Marine veteran who ran the home. "You're safe now." Mike would kneel beside him, stroking the fur along his neck. Ranger accepted the touch, but his eyes always drifted toward the door as if waiting for someone else to walk in. Veterans recognized the look. They knew it from their own reflections, the stare of someone left behind. "He's got the same ghosts we do," said Carter, an army vet who shared the house. "Except he can't talk back." The others nodded in silence, each seeing in Ranger a mirror of their own unsettled return. Therapy sessions were arranged. Ranger was taken to group meetings where veterans sat in circles, speaking about nights they couldn't forget. Sometimes the dog curled at a man's feet, his steady breathing calming shaky hands. Other times he refused to sit, pacing the room until someone broke into tears. It was as though he carried his own version of post-trauma, unable to rest because rest meant letting go. Despite the structure, Ranger struggled to bond. He ate because hunger demanded it, not because food was comfort. He accepted pats, but his tail barely wagged. Every day he pressed his nose to the air. searching for the scent he had lost in the dust of Afghanistan. His loyalty had no expiration date, and his heart refused to file Daniel away, as the army had done. One autumn evening, Mike sat on the porch steps with a cigarette in hand. Ranger rested a few feet away, his head low. "I don't know what you're looking for, boy," Mike said softly, smoke curling in the air. "But whatever it is, you're not going to find it here." Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. Weeks turned into months. Ranger seemed to grow thinner despite eating well, his energy fading under the weight of waiting. One night, the house was unusually quiet, the veterans asleep. Ranger rose, padded softly to the back door, and pressed against the latch until it clicked open. He slipped into the night without hesitation, his paws carrying him with uncanny certainty through dark streets. He traveled for hours, nose close to the ground, following scents that only he understood. The world was different here, horns honking, streetlights buzzing, the smell of gasoline mixing with fallen leaves. Still, he moved forward, tireless. By dawn, his paws were raw, his breath heavy, but his resolve unshaken. When at last the gates of Arlington came into view, Ranger stopped. His chest rose and fell as he studied the endless rows of stones stretching across the hills. Something in him settled, as though he had finally reached the place he was meant to be. Step by step he entered the grounds, his pace slowing, his eyes scanning until he stopped before one grave. He lowered himself onto the cold earth, pressing close as if the stone could return the warmth he had lost. Around him the world carried on, footsteps, whispers, rustling leaves. But for Ranger, time stilled. This was where he belonged, no matter how many nights or seasons passed, and from that night forward, the cemetery would never be without his vigil. Each morning, as the first light broke over Arlington, Ranger could be found in the same place, lying pressed against the cold ground before Daniel Cole's headstone. The grass beneath him grew thin from his weight, a patch of earth worn smooth by his vigil. Visitors noticed. At first it was only a handful of people who whispered about the German shepherd who refused to leave. Soon, though, word spread, and strangers came deliberately to witness the quiet loyalty of a forgotten war dog. An elderly woman paused one day, clutching the arm of her daughter. "Look at him," she said softly. "He's mourning. That's devotion no human can match." The daughter nodded, eyes damp, as Ranger lifted his head briefly, before settling again, with a soft whine. Children often stopped, their small voices cutting through the solemn stillness. "Why doesn't he go home?" one boy asked. His father, a Navy veteran, answered, "Because this is home for him now." "His partner is here." The child frowned, then crouched to wave at Ranger, who merely blinked, weary but resolute, his gaze never straying from the stone. As weeks passed, photos of Ranger began to circulate. A young college student shared a picture on social media with the caption, "Some bonds don't die even when people do." Within days, the post gathered thousands of reactions. Comments poured in. Veterans recalling their own K9 partners, families of soldiers who recognized the dog's grief as their own, and strangers who simply marveled at the purity of his loyalty. Reporters soon arrived. Camera crews lingered at a respectful distance, capturing the shepherd's silent vigil. One journalist whispered to a colleague, "It's the kind of story America aches for, loyalty. Sacrifice, healing." The other nodded, eyes fixed on Ranger's still frame. Not everyone agreed about what they saw. Some believed Ranger was waiting, not mourning. "Look at the way he lifts his head when people walk by," said a visitor from Ohio. "He's expecting someone. Dogs don't understand graves. He thinks his handler's coming back." The thought carried through the crowd, sparking quiet debates between strangers. But whether they called it mourning or waiting, no one could deny the devotion in Ranger's eyes. At times, the dog's soft whimpers echoed through the cemetery. Families placing flowers at other graves would pause, hearts aching at the sound. "That cry," said a mother visiting her son's headstone, "it's the same sound I make when no one's listening." She knelt and stroked Ranger's fur, tears spilling freely. Ranger accepted her touch without resistance, but returned quickly to his place before Daniel's stone. Even cemetery staff grew protective of him. Groundskeepers left bowls of water nearby, and a caretaker admitted, "He's part of this place now, like the trees and the marble." Ranger drank when thirsty, ate when food was offered, but never strayed far. One November afternoon, a chilly wind swept across the hills, carrying with it the crisp scent of approaching winter. Ranger curled tighter against the grave, his body shivering slightly. A man in uniform passing by stopped, removed his own jacket and laid it gently over the dog. "You kept your promise, buddy," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "And maybe that's what keeps the rest of us going." News outlets amplified the story nationwide, the forgotten K9 who refuses to leave his handler's grave. Interviews with visitors played on television, each describing their own encounter with the dog. Some called him a symbol of loyalty, others a guardian of memory. Ranger himself remained unaware of the attention, his world narrowed to the stone and the absence it represented. As evening fell, lights from the city beyond the cemetery flickered faintly against the horizon. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching at footsteps in the distance. His eyes scanned, hopeful, before sinking again with a quiet sigh. The waiting never ended, but in that waiting he became a living reminder that devotion does not bow to time or distance. And though no one could guess how long he would remain, each day that passed drew more hearts into the circle of his vigil, making him more than a dog by a grave. He became a story. Far from Arlington, in a hospital in San Antonio, Texas, Sergeant Daniel Cole's world was a haze of fractured memories. The sterile white walls, the rhythmic beep of machines, and the faint smell of antiseptic were all too familiar, but nothing felt real. His body, broken by the blast, was encased in bandages and braces, and his mind, shattered by the trauma, clung to fragments of his past. Daniel woke each morning disoriented, unsure of where he was or how long he had been there. His hand, once steady with a rifle, trembled as he reached for the glass of water on his bedside table. His eyes, tired and unfocused, scanned the room, the reality of his situation barely sinking in. He had been told the news. His unit had assumed he was dead, the blast too powerful to recover any remains. "Sergeant Cole, you're awake," a nurse said brightly as she entered, clipboard in hand. Her voice was warm, but it only reminded Daniel of how far removed he was from everything he had once known. He blinked at her, his throat dry. "How long?" "3 weeks, sir. You've been in and out, mostly unconscious. The doctors were worried about brain trauma." The words hit him like a punch. Brain trauma, it explained the headaches, the disorientation, the gaps in his memory. But what it didn't explain was why, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear Ranger's bark, could still feel the weight of the dog's body beside him as they'd run into battle together. "Am I dead?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The nurse paused, her face flickering with a mixture of confusion and pity. "No, Sergeant. You're alive. You're going to be okay." But Daniel didn't feel alive. He felt like a ghost, adrift, disconnected from everything he had once held dear. Weeks passed, and the steady rhythm of recovery never seemed to bring him closer to the life he had known. Physical therapy began to strengthen his body, but the memories, those moments of war and sacrifice, stayed fractured in his mind. Faces blurred, events lost in the fog of his head injury. "Sir, we've been trying to reach your family, but there's some red tape," a voice told him during one of the many phone calls he endured. "They're holding your official funeral soon." The words struck him like a blow. His family had been told he was dead. His parents, his sister, had mourned him. His life had been wrapped in a neat, clean bow, buried in a military cemetery, and he had no way of stopping it. The military's bureaucracy had moved on without him. They had made their decisions. But it wasn't the thought of his family that kept Daniel awake at night. It was the thought of Ranger. His mind was clouded with questions. What happened to him? Did he mourn me? Did anyone understand that the dog was more than just a tool? He had been his partner, his companion, his shadow through every dangerous moment. One morning, after another long, fruitless conversation with a counselor about his memories and the healing process, Daniel decided he couldn't take it any longer. He needed to know what happened to Ranger. He needed closure, something he hadn't had in the chaos of the war. He contacted the military's K9 division, trying to track down the dog he had left behind. The answer came slowly, buried under layers of paperwork and red tape, but it was clear enough. Ranger had been retired and placed with a veteran support group. The message felt like a relief and a burden all at once. "I'm coming for you, boy," Daniel whispered to the empty room, his voice firm despite the ache in his chest. But when he tried to leave the hospital, the doctors and the staff resisted. His body was still healing, still fragile from the blast. They told him he needed to stay. "You're not ready," they said. But Daniel, fueled by the desperation to find Ranger, felt the pull of duty stronger than any medical order. He wasn't dead, and neither was Ranger. That was all he needed to know. The following days were filled with a mix of anger and determination as Daniel worked to make his case to leave. Finally, the doctors relented. He was given a temporary pass, his departure marked by a flurry of paperwork and medical charts. Daniel stepped into the sunlight, feeling the weight of the outside world crash into him. His next stop was clear. "Arlington," he murmured to himself, his voice steady. "I'll find you there." The first few days after Daniel's escape from the hospital felt like a dream, a waking nightmare where nothing fit together. His body, still healing from the blast, protested every step he took. His muscles screamed for rest, his mind a haze of fragmented thoughts. But none of that mattered. Daniel had one purpose: to find Ranger. He was driven by a quiet, burning fury. How could the military just declare him dead? How could they move on so quickly when his life, his story was still unfolding? And how could they have forgotten the bond he shared with Ranger? The moment he reached the small office of the military's K9 division, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The clerks behind the counter looked at him with a mix of confusion and indifference. "Sir, you're aware that you've been listed as KIA, correct?" one of them asked, not looking up from the paperwork in front of him. "I'm not dead," Daniel said, his voice tight with frustration. "I need to know what happened to my dog." The clerk paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "We've sent the reports, Sergeant. You were KIA. Your dog Ranger was placed in the hands of a veteran support group. There's nothing else I can tell you." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "There's nothing else I can tell you." The words echoed in his head like a death sentence. He fought the urge to slam his fist on the counter. Instead, he clenched his jaw and pushed through the paperwork, the endless forms, the requests, the signatures. Every single document that passed before him reminded him of how the world had moved on without him, as though he were a ghost, erased from history. The phone calls only made things worse. "Sergeant Cole," a voice said one afternoon, sounding as though it were coming from the other side of a thick fog. "I regret to inform you that your records are still closed. The military deems your status as deceased. We cannot change this without further investigation." Daniel's heart sank. He had to force himself not to shout into the receiver. "Further investigation?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "I'm standing right here. How much more do you need?" But the bureaucracy had no answer. There were policies, procedures, and checks that had to be followed. Forms had to be processed. No matter how much he pleaded, how much he begged, the wheels of the military machine turned slowly, unfeeling. At times, Daniel felt like an intruder in a world that had forgotten him. His friends had buried him. His family had mourned. They had all moved forward, their lives continuing on without him. He was the forgotten soldier, a casualty of war who had been marked with finality, but was still walking, still breathing. Yet, the more he fought through the paperwork, the more he realized that the military's definition of death didn't matter. What mattered was Ranger. And no form, no bureaucrat, no piece of paper could erase the truth of what they had shared. One late afternoon, after hours of fruitless arguing with military officials, Daniel sat alone in a small, dimly lit cafe. The street outside was bustling with life, but Daniel felt like he was caught in a vacuum, detached from the world around him. The weight of the injustice hung heavy on him. He thought of Ranger still out there somewhere, waiting at that grave. The dog had never been told the truth. Ranger didn't know that Daniel was alive, and that realization hit Daniel with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "I'll fix this," Daniel muttered to himself. "I'll fix this, Ranger." He stood up, his body aching from the strain of moving, but his determination pushing him forward. The path ahead wasn't clear, but he knew one thing: he wasn't giving up. He wasn't dead, and neither was his bond with Ranger. It was time to make them both whole again. The story of Ranger's loyalty had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a local curiosity, whispered among the visitors of Arlington National Cemetery, soon spiraled into a media frenzy. The photographs of the German shepherd at his handler's grave, his eyes empty yet full of devotion, went viral. Every day, new people arrived, standing silently by the headstone, cameras clicking as they captured the bond that the world had forgotten, but which still burned fiercely between a dog and his soldier. News outlets, eager for a heartwarming story amid the endless cycles of tragedy, descended like vultures. "The canine who waits, a soldier's dog mourns the fallen," read the headlines. A local TV station aired a segment that evening showing Ranger's unyielding watch over the grave, the dog's fur gently swaying in the autumn breeze, his face a mixture of confusion and hope. As the coverage spread, people from across the country began to connect with Ranger's story. Social media exploded with posts, messages of encouragement, and stories of other loyal dogs who had waited for soldiers who never returned. Some even shared their own experiences of loss, how they understood the dog's grief because they had lost someone dear. A nationwide wave of empathy rolled through the country, with people rallying behind Ranger. "This dog, he's got more heart than some people I know," a woman from Florida commented on a viral post. "If we could all love like him, this world would be a better place." But not everyone was charmed. Some people saw only tragedy in Ranger's watch. "It's not healthy for the dog," one veterinarian wrote in an op-ed. "He's not grieving, he's stuck. The emotional toll on him is too much to bear." Debates raged across news channels. Was it cruel to allow Ranger to remain at the grave, refusing to move on? Or was it a testament to the depth of the bond between a soldier and his canine? The opinions clashed, but the one thing everyone agreed on was the undeniable power of the story. For Daniel, it was a bittersweet reminder of just how much had changed since the day he had been declared dead. The world had moved on without him, but Ranger remained. The dog had become a symbol of loyalty, a reminder that some bonds couldn't be broken by time or distance. As the media storm intensified, Daniel found himself facing a choice: stay hidden in the shadows or step into the light and reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. The decision wasn't easy. His body, still fragile from the explosion, protested every thought of re-entering the world. And yet the pull to find Ranger to make things right was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about reclaiming his identity, his place in the world. He needed to prove that he was more than a headline. He was alive. And Ranger wasn't the only one waiting for a reunion. A producer from a national morning show reached out, asking if Daniel would be willing to appear on live television to speak about Ranger and the bond between them. "It's a story about healing," the producer said, "about love that doesn't die, about loyalty that lasts beyond the grave." The idea of speaking in front of a camera, with millions of eyes watching, made Daniel's skin crawl. But the thought of Ranger, alone, still waiting, pushed him to agree. The world needed to hear the truth. With his decision made, Daniel began the long process of preparing for the media's gaze. His rehabbed body was still weak, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't just going to let the world tell his story. He was going to be a part of it again. As the days passed, news of Daniel's return to the spotlight spread, and anticipation built. The world was about to witness something raw, something real. Ranger had waited long enough, and so had Daniel. The days leading up to Daniel's public appearance felt like a blur of confusion and anticipation. His body, still recovering from the trauma of the explosion, ached with each movement. But it wasn't just physical pain that kept him up at night. It was the weight of what was coming. The media circus, the television interview, the spotlight on him, the world expecting him to speak about something so personal, so raw, that he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. But there was no turning back. The decision had been made. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He wasn't going to let Ranger's vigil be reduced to a symbol of loss, not when there was a chance to make it something more, something real. Daniel had spent weeks fighting for his identity. The military had declared him dead. The world had moved on. But in that moment, as the camera crews set up around him and the producer adjusted the lights in the waiting room, he felt more alive than he had in months. This was his chance to reclaim himself, to tell the truth that no one had heard yet. He stood in front of a mirror backstage, studying his reflection. The man staring back at him was unfamiliar. His face was thinner, more worn than he remembered. His eyes, though, still held a spark. That was the one thing that hadn't changed, his determination. He had survived the blast, the bureaucracy, the isolation. He was still here, and so was Ranger. "I can do this," Daniel whispered to his reflection. The words didn't feel convincing, but they were all he had. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The producer stuck his head in. "You're up next, Sergeant Cole. You ready?" Daniel nodded, his heart racing. The room was quieter now, the noise from the cameras and crew fading into the background. The moment had arrived. There was no more running, no more hiding. He was about to face the world, and everything was at stake. His identity, his future, and the truth of what had happened to Ranger. He walked out into the studio, the bright lights blinding at first. The host, a well-groomed woman with a warm smile, greeted him with open arms. "Thank you for joining us today, Sergeant Cole," she said, her voice soft yet professional. "We've all been touched by your story, and the nation has been following the bond between you and your canine partner, Ranger." Daniel managed a small smile, but inside, his stomach churned. This wasn't a story for entertainment. This wasn't a soundbite. This was his life, his dog, his journey. But the world needed to hear it, so he would speak. "Thank you for having me," Daniel said, his voice hoarse but steady. "It means a lot to me." She nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. "So, let's talk about Ranger. You've been watching over his grave for months now, despite being declared dead. Can you tell us how that came to be?" Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. The story he had carried for so long was finally going to be told. Ranger and I, we were partners, not just in war but in life. He was there when I needed him most, and I failed him when I was taken from him. But I'm not dead, and I'm here now. The host leaned in, her eyes filled with empathy. "What was it like when you first heard that Ranger had been waiting for you? That he had been sitting by your grave believing you were gone?" The question hit harder than Daniel expected. His throat tightened, and for a moment he had to fight to hold back tears. "It broke me," he admitted quietly. "I never wanted him to feel abandoned. I never wanted him to think I'd left him. But when I saw those pictures, when I heard about his vigil, I knew I had to come back. Not just for me, but for him too." Daniel paused, his emotions running high, but he kept his focus. "The truth is, Ranger never gave up on me, and I won't give up on him." The host gave him a moment, then gently asked, "So, what happens now? What's next for you and Ranger?" Daniel glanced down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if to steady himself. "Now it's time to make things right. We'll go back to Arlington, and we'll start over. I'll bring him home." The words were simple, but they were the truth. The next chapter wasn't just about healing. It was about finding a way back to each other, about rebuilding the bond that had never really been broken, even though it had been tested by time and distance. The interview continued, but Daniel's mind was already on the road ahead, on the journey that would bring him to Ranger, the dog who had never stopped waiting. The road from Texas to Virginia felt endless, a stretch of asphalt winding through states Daniel had never really noticed before. The car's engine hummed steadily beneath him, but inside his thoughts were racing. It had been years since he had driven this far, this determined. His body, still bruised from the explosion, ached with every shift of the wheel, but he barely noticed. It was the pull toward Arlington, the pull toward Ranger, that kept him focused. Daniel had always thought of himself as a soldier first, a man second. His life had been defined by missions, by the rhythm of deployment and the weight of responsibility. But now, as he cruised through small towns and endless highways, he realized how much he had missed, how much had been taken from him during his time away. He thought of his family, of the funeral they had held for him, of the grief he had unknowingly caused them. But more than that, he thought of Ranger. Every mile that passed was one step closer to the dog who had never let go of him, who had never been told the truth. The world had moved on, but not Ranger. The dog had kept his vigil at the grave, waiting for a partner who hadn't been able to return, and Daniel had made a promise, one he was determined to keep. As the landscape changed, flat plains giving way to rolling hills and thick forests, Daniel's mind drifted back to Afghanistan. The air was hot there, the dust relentless, but the bond he'd shared with Ranger was clear and simple. They had been a team. When Ranger had sat by his side after the blast, when he had pressed his muzzle into Daniel's chest, Daniel had felt the dog's fear and loyalty all at once. It was the kind of bond that didn't need words, that didn't need explanation. It was instinct. But what had happened since? He'd been gone for too long. Ranger had waited alone, and Daniel had been trapped in a world of paperwork and bureaucracy. The world had written him off. But here he was, on a long, lonely drive back to the one place he could feel like himself again. The radio crackled with static as Daniel switched stations, trying to focus on anything but the weight in his chest. He thought about the interview earlier, about the hundreds of eyes that had watched him speak. The world now knew about Ranger's vigil, and the world seemed to care. But it wasn't about the media coverage. It wasn't about the nation's sympathy. It was about Ranger and the promise Daniel had made when he'd first left for Afghanistan, that he would never abandon him. Nightfall came faster than Daniel expected, and the headlights of his car illuminated the winding road ahead. The sky stretched above him, dark and wide, and for a moment he felt small beneath it. He thought of his parents, of the funeral they had planned for him, of how they had said goodbye to a son they thought was lost. And yet here he was, alive, driving toward a reunion that would mean everything to both him and the dog who had never been told the truth. He stopped at a gas station just outside of Richmond. As he refueled, his hands shook slightly as he unscrewed the cap. There was a man in the corner of the lot, a stranger who glanced at him, then at the faded military decals on the back of Daniel's car. "Thank you for your service, son," the man called out, a small but sincere smile on his face. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. "I'm just trying to get home." The stranger didn't say anything more, but he gave Daniel a brief, understanding look before walking inside the station. Daniel's heart clenched at the simplicity of the exchange. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't just a headline. He was just a man, one who had promised to make things right. By the time he pulled into the outskirts of Arlington, the quiet weight of the night settled around him. The trees lining the streets swayed gently in the wind, and the faint sound of traffic buzzed in the distance. Daniel parked near the entrance to the cemetery, his eyes drawn to the sea of white headstones stretching across the hill. He sat there for a long moment, taking in the stillness of the place. This was where he had been forgotten. This was where Ranger had waited. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped out of the car, the cold air sharp against his skin. His journey had led him here, to this moment, to this place. He wasn't alone anymore. With determination in his stride, he walked toward the entrance of Arlington National Cemetery, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around Arlington felt thick with silence, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind as it whispered through the tall trees. The cemetery, with its endless rows of white headstones, had an almost reverent stillness to it. The bright lights from the distant city shimmered faintly on the horizon, but here in this sacred space, time seemed to move slower, as if honoring those who had given so much. Daniel's heart pounded with each step he took across the gravel paths, the crunch beneath his boots a constant reminder of how far he had come. Every nerve in his body was on edge, both from the exhaustion of the long journey and the weight of the moment. The graveyard felt like a world away from the noise and chaos of the interview, the television cameras, and the endless media reports. This was real. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had been here before, a ghost of the man he once was, surrounded by strangers and memories of a life left behind. But today was different. He was alive. He was standing on his own 2 feet, and there was something he had to do, something he owed to the dog who had waited for him day after day, without ever being told the truth. Ranger was here, somewhere. The thought struck Daniel's chest like a fist. The dog had been waiting at the grave for so long, alone and confused, believing that his handler had been lost forever. It was time to make that right. As Daniel approached the familiar spot, he could see the faint shape of a dog lying at the foot of a headstone. Ranger. The sight of the German shepherd brought a surge of emotion, relief, love, and an overwhelming sadness. The bond they had shared in the field, the connection that had kept them alive during the worst of times, had never truly faded. And yet, seeing the dog here, so loyal, so still, made everything feel raw. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. His breath caught in his throat as memories of their time together flashed before his eyes. The missions, the quiet moments in the desert when Ranger had sat by his side, the way the dog had looked at him as if they were one. The bond between them had never been just that of a soldier and his canine. It had been a partnership, a family, forged in the most unforgiving of places. Ranger's ears twitched as Daniel's shadow fell over the grave. The dog's head lifted slowly, his eyes meeting Daniel's with a flicker of recognition. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Ranger's body stiffened, his tail twitching once, twice. His eyes widened as though trying to comprehend what was happening. And then the moment Daniel had longed for arrived. Ranger shot to his feet, his body trembling with excitement, and in an instant he was running toward him, his paws kicking up the earth beneath them. The dog's joyous barks echoed through the quiet cemetery as though the entire world could hear his elation. "Ranger," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he crouched down, arms open wide. The dog reached him, jumping up with a force that nearly knocked him over, covering Daniel's face in licks, his tail wagging furiously. Daniel couldn't contain the tears that threatened to spill. He held Ranger tightly, feeling the dog's warmth, the familiar weight of him in his arms. "I'm here, boy, I'm here," Daniel murmured over and over again, his voice breaking. He buried his face in Ranger's fur, his hand stroking the dog's back. "I'm not gone, I'm right here." Ranger's barks grew softer, his movements slower, as though he too needed to process the truth of the moment. But Daniel didn't care how long it took. This reunion wasn't about words, it was about healing, a bond renewed, a promise fulfilled. The world seemed to fade away as they stood there, locked in the moment that was theirs alone. The noise of the city, the flashing cameras, the media, all of it faded into the background. All that mattered was this: Daniel, alive and whole, and Ranger, the dog who had never stopped waiting. After a long while they both sank to the ground, Daniel leaning back against the headstone, Ranger lying at his feet. For the first time in years, the weight on Daniel's shoulders seemed to lift. He wasn't alone anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. And neither had Ranger. The promise he had made to the dog was fulfilled. He had come back, and Ranger was no longer waiting. They were together again, not just in body but in spirit. The world could see their story now, but Daniel knew that what mattered most was the quiet understanding they shared in this moment. This was where it all started, and this was where it would always be. The days following the reunion felt like a dream Daniel wasn't ready to wake from. The world outside Arlington had been watching, waiting, and now it was flooded with emotions and reactions, each one a ripple that grew larger with every passing hour. As Daniel and Ranger sat together, the media storm outside seemed distant, but it couldn't be avoided. News outlets, social media, and even local communities were in awe of the bond the two shared. The pictures of their reunion, the soldier once thought dead embracing the dog who had never stopped waiting, touched something deep within the hearts of those who saw it. The country, it seemed, needed a reminder of loyalty, of love that didn't fade with time. On the morning after the reunion, the first signs of the media's intense interest began to flood in. It wasn't just local news stations that were covering the story anymore. National outlets had picked it up. The story of a soldier and his K9 had moved past being just a personal one. It had become a symbol. Ranger's vigil was no longer just a local tale of devotion. It was a metaphor, one that captured the hearts of thousands. People saw themselves in it. There were veterans who had lost comrades, families who had lost loved ones, all of them silently acknowledging the grief and loyalty they too carried. "It's like he's waiting for us too," said an Army veteran who commented on one of the viral posts. "We all get left behind in some way, but seeing them together again reminds me that hope isn't dead." You don't give up on those you love. News interviews flooded in. Daniel appeared on talk shows, his voice steady but laced with a certain vulnerability. When asked about the years spent apart, he spoke honestly, with raw emotion that resonated with the audience. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to endure," Daniel said during one interview. "The military, they declared me dead. But I never gave up. Neither did Ranger." He paused, his eyes glazing over as the memory of Ranger waiting for him came rushing back. What they didn't understand was that for him, I wasn't gone. I couldn't be. People watched as he shared his pain and hope, and the interview sparked even more discussion. The public's response was overwhelmingly supportive. Many viewers shared their own stories of grief, of waiting, of healing. Others saw in Ranger and Daniel's reunion a beacon of light, proof that it was never too late to heal, to reconnect, to love. But with every story that tugged on the heartstrings, there were others who questioned the dog's prolonged presence at the grave. Some vets and animal behaviorists expressed concern about the emotional toll on Ranger, cautioning that a dog's persistent grief could affect its health. Daniel heard these concerns, but he wasn't swayed. In one of his interviews, he calmly addressed the issue. "I understand where they're coming from, but the truth is Ranger was never just a dog. He's a partner. He's family. What you see, what you felt when you saw him waiting, that's real, that's love. And it's not something you can fix with a schedule or a rule." Despite the occasional naysayer, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People began to rally around Ranger and Daniel, creating fundraising efforts to support veterans' service dog programs. Others organized walks and charity events, naming them after the loyal K9, who had waited for years without ever knowing if he would see his partner again. Social media posts flooded in with hashtags like Ranger's Vigil and Never Give Up, sharing the story of the reunion and emphasizing the importance of love, loyalty, and perseverance. But it wasn't just the media or the general public that was reacting. The local community in Arlington, once indifferent to Ranger's presence, now saw the dog as a symbol of their town's resilience and spirit. Residents started to bring flowers and small gifts to the grave, where Daniel and Ranger had reunited, leaving tokens of appreciation, reminding the soldier and his dog that they were no longer alone. One afternoon, Daniel and Ranger visited the grave together again. This time it wasn't just to mourn, it was to celebrate. They stood together, looking at the stone that had once been a symbol of separation, but now marked the place of their reunion. The crowds that had gathered stepped back respectfully, giving them space. Daniel whispered, "This is your home too, boy." He knelt beside the stone, a soft breeze brushing his face, as if nature itself was acknowledging the powerful love that had been restored between him and Ranger. The noise of the world was still there, still loud, but in this moment, all that mattered was that they had each other again. And the world, for the first time, was finally paying attention to the kind of loyalty that never fades, no matter how long it takes. The days following their reunion were filled with quiet moments and small victories, the kind that are often overlooked, but are vital for healing. For Daniel and Ranger, it wasn't just about reuniting, it was about learning to live again, together. The bond that had been forged in the harshest of circumstances was now being rebuilt in a peaceful, almost mundane setting, one that was far removed from the chaos they had known in the past. The first few nights, Daniel stayed with Ranger at a small veterans' housing facility just outside of Arlington. The place was calm, surrounded by green grass and old trees that whispered in the wind. It was a stark contrast to the war zones they had both faced, but the simplicity of the space provided them with the quiet they needed to begin the slow process of healing. Daniel spent hours sitting with Ranger on the porch, watching the world go by, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Ranger would sit beside him, his head resting on Daniel's leg, content in the shared silence. There were no explosions, no gunfire, just the gentle sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But even in the peace of these moments, the weight of what they had both endured lingered. There were nights when Daniel would wake from restless dreams, his heart pounding, only to find Ranger by his side, his nose gently nudging Daniel's hand as if to reassure him that he wasn't alone. They had both been through hell, and the scars they carried, visible and invisible, were a testament to that. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Daniel walked with Ranger through a quiet park nearby. The air had a chill to it, the first hint of fall's arrival. As they moved along the path, Daniel thought about everything they had gone through, the loss, the uncertainty, the separation. But he also thought about how far they had come, how much they had survived. They had weathered storms together, and now they were learning to heal in their own time, in their own way. Ranger trotted ahead, his movements slower now, but still purposeful. He was no longer the young, sprightly dog Daniel had known in Afghanistan, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dulled. If anything, it had grown more steady, more sure, just like Daniel. They had both been broken, but they were learning to heal piece by piece. As they sat on a bench overlooking a pond, Daniel stroked Ranger's head, his fingers running through the familiar fur. "For you know, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "we've both got a lot of healing to do." Ranger looked up at him, his eyes soft, understanding. There was no need for words. They had always communicated without them, through shared glances and quiet moments of connection. Ranger had been with him through the worst, and now, together, they would face the future, whatever that held. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to find his footing again. He attended therapy sessions with other veterans, speaking about his experience, about Ranger's loyalty, and about the struggles he had faced coming back to a world that had moved on without him. But it wasn't just the therapy that helped. It was the quiet companionship of Ranger, the dog who had never let go. There were hard days, of course, days when the past threatened to overwhelm him, when the memories of war and loss crept back into his mind. But there was always Ranger, there to ground him, there to offer his presence, his support, his unwavering loyalty. And slowly, very slowly, Daniel started to find peace. Ranger, too, began to settle. He no longer paced the house at night, searching for something that had been lost. He still had moments of restlessness, but they were fewer and farther between. He would lie beside Daniel in the evenings, content, his breathing steady. Together, they had created a new rhythm, a new life, one that was born not from the devastation they had faced, but from the strength they had found in each other. The road to healing was not easy, and it was not quick. But for Daniel and Ranger, it was a road worth traveling together. With each passing day, they grew stronger, more connected, and more certain that whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them side by side. In a world that had been filled with so much loss, they had found something beautiful, a bond that transcended time, a love that never faded, and a healing that had only just begun. Though Daniel and Ranger had found their way back to each other, their journey toward full reintegration into civilian life wasn't without its hurdles. The trauma they had experienced, though softened by time, still clung to them like an invisible weight. They had learned to live together again, but the world outside, the world of paperwork, bureaucracy, and the harsh reality of a life they had left behind, was not as kind. One of the first challenges Daniel faced was finding steady work. He had been out of the military for several years now, and even though his military training and service dog experience were invaluable, the transition to civilian employment felt like an uphill battle. Daniel sat across from potential employers in stuffy office buildings, answering questions he had prepared for, but nothing seemed to click. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Cole, but we need someone with more experience in the private sector," one hiring manager had told him. "Your military background is impressive," another said, "but we're looking for a different skill set." The rejection letters piled up, each one another reminder of how easily the world seemed to move on. Daniel had been a hero to his comrades, to Ranger, but here in the civilian world he felt invisible. The simple act of applying for jobs had become a daily reminder that the world no longer valued the life he had once known. Even on the rare occasions when Daniel was invited to interviews, he struggled to feel like he belonged. His body was still healing from the physical injuries of the blast, but it was the emotional scars that were harder to hide. The long silences, the flashes of memory from the battlefield that could come at any time, left him distracted. The weight of PTSD gnawed at him, the panic attacks sometimes unpredictable, sometimes overwhelming. Ranger, however, had remained a constant, a steady source of calm amidst the uncertainty. At home, Daniel could rely on the dog to ease his stress, but when it came to the world outside, nothing felt as comfortable. Ranger, too, had moments of discomfort. Though he no longer wandered the streets searching for Daniel, there were days when the dog grew restless, pacing in circles as if sensing Daniel's internal struggle. "Hey, boy," Daniel would say, his voice thick. "I know it's tough, but we're doing this together, okay?" Ranger would respond with his usual comforting presence, sitting next to Daniel, his head resting on his leg. It was this quiet support that kept Daniel grounded, but even that wasn't always enough. One afternoon, after another unsuccessful job search, Daniel walked to the nearby park with Ranger by his side. The air was cool, the sky a brilliant blue, but Daniel felt the weight of his disappointment. Sitting down on a bench, he ran his fingers through his hair, exhausted. Ranger sat beside him, as if waiting for a cue to help. "I'm sorry, buddy," Daniel muttered. I don't know how to fix this." It wasn't just about finding work. It was about fitting into a world that had changed so much while he was away. The people who knew him before the war saw him differently now, as though he were no longer the same man. His family, though supportive, struggled to understand the distance that had grown between them. He was still Daniel, but he was different. The war had taken more than his physical health. It had taken pieces of his identity. Ranger, sensing his distress, nudged Daniel's hand with his nose, his eyes full of understanding. Daniel looked down at the dog, his chest tightening. "I don't know how to get back, Ranger," he admitted quietly, "but I promise you I'll keep trying." In the coming weeks, the challenges didn't subside, but each day, with Ranger by his side, Daniel took small steps forward. He began attending therapy more regularly, meeting with other veterans who had been through similar struggles. In their stories, he found solace. He wasn't alone in this. And though the world outside was tough, there were places and people that understood the long road he had to travel. One evening, Daniel met a fellow veteran at a local veterans group meeting. The man, Paul, had been struggling with his own reintegration. They talked for hours, sharing their experiences, their fears, and their hopes. As they parted ways, Paul clapped Daniel on the back. "I've got a good dog there, Cole," Paul said with a smile, "and you've got a hell of a lot more in you than you think." That conversation stuck with Daniel for days. It was a reminder that reintegration wasn't a linear process. There would be setbacks, sure, but it wasn't the setbacks that defined him. It was his ability to get back up, to keep moving forward. And with Ranger by his side, he knew that no matter how hard it got, he would never stop trying. The sun set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Daniel sat on the grass, his back resting against the same headstone where he and Ranger had reunited. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This place, once a symbol of his absence, had now become a place of renewal. He wasn't just visiting a grave anymore. He was marking the beginning of something new, something that had been lost but was slowly being rebuilt. Ranger lay beside him, his head resting on Daniel's lap, his breathing slow and steady. The dog was getting older now, his movements less spry than they once were. But his eyes, those familiar amber eyes, still held the same fierce loyalty, the same love that had brought them both this far. The years of separation, the pain of being declared dead, had not diminished the bond between them. If anything, it had deepened it. Daniel's fingers traced the edges of Ranger's ear, his mind wandering through the past, through the days of war, through the reunion, and through the struggles that had followed. But he wasn't thinking about those things now. In this moment, with the dog by his side and the world peaceful around him, he was simply grateful. "You know, boy," Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, I didn't think I'd get here." He paused, his chest tightening. "But we did. Together." Ranger shifted slightly, nuzzling into Daniel's side, as if to say, "Yes, we did." The past few months had been challenging, finding stability in a world that had moved on without him, the fight for recognition, the constant struggle with his inner demons. But now, as he sat in the quiet of the cemetery, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and it was because of the dog beside him. In the distance, the soft sounds of traffic buzzed, but here, in this sacred space, there was an undeniable stillness. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt as though he belonged. The world wasn't rushing him anymore. There was no deadline, no expectation, no pressure. It was just him and Ranger, two survivors, reunited at last. Daniel's thoughts turned to the future. It was still uncertain, still full of obstacles, but with Ranger by his side, Daniel felt ready to face whatever came next. They had both come so far, and even though the road ahead was unknown, Daniel knew they would walk it together. The media attention had died down. The world had stopped watching, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the quiet moments they shared, the simple, unspoken understanding between them. Ranger had never given up on him, and Daniel had made a promise to never give up on the dog. Now, they had found a new kind of peace, a peace that didn't require the approval of others, just the quiet acknowledgement of what they had been through together. Daniel stood slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. Ranger got up with him, the dog's tail wagging gently as he looked up at Daniel with those familiar eyes. "Come on, old boy," Daniel said with a soft chuckle. "Let's get going." They walked away from the grave side by side, the weight of the world seeming a little lighter with each step. The evening sky stretched above them, a canvas of deep blues and oranges, and in that moment Daniel felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. Ranger trotted beside him, his pace steady, his presence grounding. Together they had fought battles, on the field and within themselves, and now they were walking into the next chapter of their lives. A new chapter, a new beginning. And this time, Daniel knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, as they always had.